Hello everybody, this is Freddy with Freddy Can Fly. In today's Heli's Tips and Tricks video, we're going to take a look at how to properly bind your transmitter to your helicopter. And we're going to be using a Spectrum DX7 and an AR8000 receiver. They're both 2.4 gigahertz receivers at DSMX. And we're going to take a look at the list of materials you will need to get this done, and we'll get it done properly. That way we're not worried about losing signals, things like that. Guys, take into consideration the bind process is pretty damn important, so we want to make sure we get it done right. So let's take a look at what I've got sitting out here and let's get started. Okay, so a list of materials we will need. We are going to need our transmitter. Okay, now take into consideration I am using a nitro heli, so you must have a 7 or more compatible radio. For electrics you only need 6 to support them. Okay, we're also going to need our supplied bind plug. These are usually going to be identified with an actual bind label. If not, they're always just a plug with a looped wire to do our binding process. Okay, we're going to also need our helicopter. Now you can bind your receiver before the heli's built. I usually do it once all my electronics are installed. But typically you want to bind without any servos installed, and that's just for the safety of the servos. If you're using fly barless, you want to go through and make sure you're putting the right amount of voltage into the servos, things like that. That way we don't fry or damage any servos. Okay. We're also going to need our receiver, obviously, complete with our satellite. Now if you're using just a fly barless system running satellites, the bind process is still pretty much the same. You're just going to use the fly barless unit as the receiver. Okay, so go ahead and make sure that the satellite is properly plugged into the receiver. Okay, and the next thing we're going to need to look at is how to provide power. I'm using a regulator. On most 600 size and up helis, you're going to have a regulator of some sort unless you're running straight off of your main battery packs. So we're going to need something to supply power, okay, and you're going to want to make sure that that's plugged into the receiver. That way when we plug it in or power it on, we'll get into our bind mode. So first step, guys, is we're going to go ahead and plug our bind plug in to the proper slot on the receiver. So let's take a closer look at how we're going to complete that step. Okay, so basically step 1 is going to consist of placing our bind plug in the correct slot designated on the receiver. Now you can see that we've got one labeled, usually it's going to be labeled bind slash bat, or actually mine says DAT or DAT, whichever the case. So what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to insert our bind plug into the bind slot. Now every receiver has got a specific way in which the plug has to be inserted. It's either going to be facing this way, or if we rotate it, it'll be facing that way. And that's usually going to be designated on the actual receiver itself. You'll see this little weird looking set of symbols on here. Okay, obviously one's your negative wire, your positive, and then your signal wire is that weird pie looking, I don't even know if it's a pie, but you know, looks strange. Okay. Now also on the front facing of it, every single one of these connectors has a curved edge. I don't know if you guys can see it or not, but there's a curved edge and a square edge, one top, one bottom. Okay, and that's also a good indicator of which way. You don't want to be plugging these in backwards because you can damage the receiver and the pins. So, but for the most part, I've got all my stuff plugged in, so I know which direction I'm going. Just make sure you take special note on yours. So I'm going to go ahead and insert my bind plug into the bind slot. Make sure it's seated down all the way. Okay, and that's going to complete this step. Let's move on to the next one, which is going to be making sure our radio is ready to be bound. Okay guys, so the next thing we want to do is make sure that our radio is properly ready to be bound. And realistically all this requires is we want to make sure that when we power on our radio, we are on the selected model that we wish to be bound to, which mine says 600 nitro. Okay, and at this point in time, this is really all we need to worry about for binding. If you do have servos and things like that plugged in, make sure you go through some of the other specific radio setups, that way you don't damage anything. But as I said previously, I like to bind mine with strictly just power supply, receivers. That way we can avoid doing anything at this time besides just binding. So go ahead and make sure you're on the correct model, power off the radio, and let it sit idly for a couple seconds here while we get into the next step. Okay, so here we go. What you're going to want to do first is get your power supply ready. Of course, mine's a regulator, so I can plug my battery pack in first without having any power yet supplied. Okay, so I'm going to get my battery ready. If you're using an electric heli, you're going to plug it in and you're going to get power. Okay, make sure our bind plug is properly inserted. That's step one. Okay, so now our bind plug's in. Make sure your radio is turned off, but it's on the selected model you wish to be bound to. Once you've completed those steps, we'll go ahead and provide some power. Okay, you'll notice the first thing that's going to happen here is both the satellite and the actual receiver itself have a consecutive flashing light. Typically they're going to be orange or whatever color it is that's designated on your receiver. Okay. Now what we need to do is, usually on every radio there's going to be some sort of a dedicated binding button or switch or toggle, and they're usually labeled bind. On the back of my DX7 is my binding button right here. On some radios like the DX8, it's an actual switch you hold down, but whatever the case is, locate this. Okay. Now at this time you're usually going to want to depress the button and keep it held in while you power on the radio. Okay, do not release that bind toggle, otherwise it can interrupt the binding process. Okay, so here we go. We're going to hold down our bind button, and we're also going to power on at the same time. And let's pay attention to what our lights do. Okay, they're going to turn off. And what we're looking for is, we're still holding down the button. We want to wait for both of those lights to turn completely solid. Once they turn solid, I usually continue to hold the button down for at least a good maybe 20 seconds or so. Just kind of keep it pressed down, pay attention to your lights, make sure they're staying locked. Now, once you see solid lights, we know we've bound properly. So what we're going to do is we're going to release our bind switch or toggle, okay? And we now know that we're bound. So to double check that we did everything correctly, we're going to go ahead and power off, let everything turn off. Go ahead and turn off the radio off. Okay, now we're going to just remove our bind plug from the bind slot, set it to the side, and we're going to do this a little backwards now to make sure. We're going to just boot up the heli like normal. So now radio is going to turn on first, wait for everything to fully boot up, give your radio a few seconds to start working. Okay, now we're going to provide power. When this happens, we should see both of these eventually turn solid and remain solid. That's the key point here. So we're going to go ahead and power up. We're going to wait a couple seconds. We've got our two solid lights and everything seems to be working. So we should now be properly bound to our helicopter or car or truck or whatever application you're using. So let's go ahead and power everything off now. Guys, always make sure it goes radio, then receiver, and when you're powering off, always turn receiver off, then radio. That way we don't avoid any sort of problems with electronics acting weird or sporadic because they still have power but no signal. Alright guys, so that just about sums it up. We should now be properly bound to our receiver. Everything should be working correctly. If you see any odd problems along the way, like satellites won't turn solid, they want to keep flashing. Some satellites will actually emit a red LED if there's a problem. If you're not getting power to one or the other, go back and double check your wiring, your other electronics, make sure everything's as is and needs to be. But realistically, the binding process is that simple. So if there's any other complications along the way, you may have faulty electronics, you may have a bad soldering connection, or you just may be doing something silly that you're overlooking. So follow those steps, you guys should be able to get bound fairly simple. That's really all there is left to cover. So as always, I thank you guys for watching, and remember, Freddy can fly, so can you.